The sharp crack of splintering would shatter the quiet dawn, jolting me from a restless sleep. I threw off the crochet blanket my grandmother made for me years ago, a rainbow of soft yarn that always made me feel safe, and rushed to the window. In the pale light, I could just make out a huddle of bodies hunched at the end of Grandma's driveway. Moments later, the sound echoed again, a sledgehammer thundering against her beloved picket fence. Then came the pop of metal prongs snapping into place, spikes hammered right into the ground at the property line. I whipped on a robe, practically stumbling over my own feet as I sprinted to the front door. Before me stood two broad-shouldered workers in neon vests, their tools glinting menacingly in the glow of the porch light. Beyond them was an older gentleman, hair combed back with military precision, clipboard in hand. He wore a smug little grin like he was relishing the destruction. "What on earth are you doing?" I demanded, voice shaking as I tried to remember the breathing exercises Grandma taught me. "Keep calm in the face of intimidation," she'd always say. The older man, presumably the supervisor, glanced over his half-rimmed glasses with a look of bored disdain. "Homeowners Association business," he drawled. "Your grandmother's property is in violation of 4 separate community guidelines: fence height, driveway border, lawn decor, and extraneous yard signage." With one swift motion, he pointed toward a small painted sign that read, "I love my roses," perched among Grandma's prized rose bushes. All must be removed to comply with Maplewood Terrace regulations. "But you can't just show up in the middle of the night, tearing down fences and driving spikes into the yard," I protested. "That's trespassing." He smirked, tapping his clipboard. "The Maplewood Terrace HOA reserves the right to implement immediate corrective measures for repeated violations. It's not trespassing when you've been served formal notices." She's had plenty of warnings. The man's self-assured posture clashed with the reality that he was literally defacing private property, and his sense of entitlement, that he could just barge onto someone's land, unannounced, felt beyond arrogant. My grandmother, Harriet Storm, had lived in this single-story cottage for nearly 50 years. She scrimped and saved to buy it outright after my grandfather died, cherishing every inch of the small garden out front. I'd practically grown up in those rose bushes, playing hide-and-seek behind that cheerful white fence. Now, after months of petty notes and threatened fines, it looked like the HOA had decided to escalate. In the midst of the chaos, my grandmother appeared at the doorway behind me, dressed in her flannel nightgown, hair half in curlers, but with a gaze that could freeze the Atlantic. "Excuse me," she said calmly, though her voice pulsed with suppressed anger. "Put your tools down right now. I didn't agree to any of this." Her composure unsettled the crew. The men in neon vests paused, glancing at each other. The older man tapped his clipboard again, trying to hold his ground. "Ma'am, we're well within our rights. This is a matter of community interest. Your fence was half an inch taller than regulations. We sent multiple letters requesting compliance." Grandma's eyes didn't waver. "I never saw any official warnings. You sure you had the right address?" He bristled. "Don't be coy. The Maplewood Terrace HOA office never makes that kind of mistake." I could feel the tension radiating off her, but her lips twitched in a cool smile. "Well, I suggest you and your crew step off my property unless you want to discuss legal ramifications." That single sentence, so calmly spoken, had them hesitating. I caught the surprise in the older man's expression, as if just now registering Grandma's unwavering backbone. This was my grandmother through and through, the woman who had single-handedly raised me after my mother passed away. She was sweet as honey pies on Sunday afternoons, but beneath that comforting surface lay a fierce sense of justice and a mind honed by years of forging her own path. Only I wondered how far that sense of justice would take us against an entire HOA board with powerful local connections. The older man collected himself, cleared his throat, and started muttering about unresolved fees and probable cause for further measures. But the conversation was over as far as Grandma was concerned. She calmly lifted her phone and snapped photos of the men, their tools, the battered fence, and the newly installed metal spikes that now bristled along the property line like a row of barbed wire. When she held her phone up with a final click, she simply said, Don't move a muscle until I'm done documenting. They grimaced, but eventually slunk away to their truck, grumbling about uppity seniors and toothless threats. Once they left, we stood on the porch in the crisp morning air. My heart was pounding, and I expected Grandma to rage or cry or collapse in exhaustion. Instead, she let out a long breath, slid her phone into her pocket, and patted my shoulder. "Go make some coffee, Morgan," she said. "We have a fight on our hands, but let's not lose our heads. I've handled worse, believe me." I followed her into the kitchen, the door squeaking behind us. The cottage smelled of chamomile, old books, and the lingering aroma of last night's pot roast. Even with the broken fence out front and fresh holes in the grass, there was something unshakably warm about this place. I reached for the kettle, turned on the burner, and watched Grandma remove her curlers one by one, a soldier preparing for battle. So, I began hesitating. They must have known you'd make a fuss. But did they really think they could just do that? Grandma's calm gray eyes met mine. "I'm afraid the folks in Maplewood Terrace are about to learn something they never bothered to ask, whose door they've been pounding on. Let me tell you a little secret, Morgan. I'm not just a feeble old lady in a cottage. I'm Harriet Storm, Assistant State Prosecutor. And if they think they can harass me, they've got another thing coming." I gulped. I'd known she was involved in legal work, but I never quite realized the extent of her influence. "You're sure you can outmaneuver them?" She gave me a reassuring nod. "Being a state prosecutor means I've looked hardened criminals in the eye. This is just a pack of local busybodies playing power games." Her lips curved. "But a game is a game, and I intend to play it better than they do." Right then, the kettle let out a sharp whistle, and we both jumped into action. Grandma poured hot water into her favorite teapot, methodical as ever. Outside, the first rays of sun glinted off the battered remains of her fence and those ugly spikes. I shuddered at the sight. It felt like we were at the beginning of a siege, and the question nagging at my mind was, how far would the HOA go? By mid-morning, the destruction was impossible to ignore. Nosy neighbors began gathering in small clusters, murmuring behind cupped hands at the sight of Grandma's newly compromised fence. Some looked genuinely concerned, others simply curious or mildly entertained. In a neat suburb like Maplewood Terrace, drama was scarce, unless you counted rumor-fueled gossip about overgrown hedges or late-night barking dogs. A crew coming in to correct a property's aesthetic was practically front-page news. I didn't realize the HOA had gotten so militant, I said, watching from the kitchen window as a pair of joggers slowed to gape at the row of metal spikes. Grandma was busy typing on her laptop at the dining table. "They've always been strict," she said, eyes never leaving the screen. "But from my quick research, it looks like they might have overstepped the legal boundaries." She scrolled through a page, brow furrowing. "This new HOA president, Sylvester R. Perkins, seems to have implemented some drastic measures in the last year. Fines, forced landscaping, even a potential lawsuit against a resident who refused to paint their mailbox the approved shade of taupe." She paused. "The question is why?" I pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "Maybe it's a power trip? Some folks just love micromanaging." Grandma nodded. "Could be, but I suspect there's more. For instance, these forced modifications often coincide with a series of fees. There was a case last month where the HOA replaced someone's rose garden with HOA-approved shrubbery and billed them $3,000 for the service. She tapped a PDF. I'm reading that when the homeowner refused to pay, the HOA threatened foreclosure. The poor woman ended up settling for $1,000 just to keep her house. My stomach nodded. That sounds like extortion. Her gaze was steely. It is. And I have a hunch they target older residents who might not have the resources or energy to fight back. We fell into a pensive silence. Maplewood Terrace had always seemed picturesque, tree-lined streets, well-kept lawns, and the occasional block party. But beneath the glossy veneer, the HOA apparently operated like a shadowy regime, controlling every detail of its residents' lives down to the color of a porch light. "Grandma," I ventured, "don't you have the authority to do something about this in your capacity as Assistant State Prosecutor?" She pressed her lips together. "Technically, I specialize in criminal cases, burglary, embezzlement, that sort of thing. HOAs often fall under civil law or local ordinances. However, if we can prove these forced measures cross into criminal territory, we'll have them where it hurts. But how do we gather proof? I asked. A slow smile lit her features. We build a case. Document everything. Talk to neighbors who've been wronged. Collect evidence of malfeasance. This will be more than a personal dispute. We'll show a pattern of abuse. Sylvester Perkins won't know what hit him. The resolve in Grandma's voice thrilled me. This was the woman who'd taught me about fairness and justice, who'd hammered into me that bullies often cower when someone stands up to them. I was proud and determined to help in any way I could. Just then, the doorbell rang. I popped up from my chair and peeked through the curtain. At the stoop stood a wiry man in a collared shirt, holding a small manila envelope. Pressing my lips tight, I quickly unlocked the door, only opening a crack. Delivery from the Maplewood Terrace Homeowners Association. He said in a tone that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. Just need a signature, ma'am. Grandma joined me at the door, pen in hand. Before signing, she examined the envelope. This official notice states, she prompted. The man gulped. It's, an invoice for the fence removal and property reconfiguration costs. It's itemized. He swallowed again, totaling $1,350. My pulse pounded. You mean they charge people for vandalizing their own fences? He shrugged apologetically. Look, I'm just the messenger. I don't work for them. I'm hired by courier service. If you don't sign, I can't leave the notice, but they'll say you refuse delivery. Then you get penalized more. Grandma nodded curtly and signed. I understand. Thank you, sir. She shut the door, envelope clutched tight in her hand. With careful precision, she used her phone to take pictures of every page inside, muttering under her breath about the nerve of these people. That afternoon, she placed calls to neighbors who'd been similarly hassled. I listened from the kitchen table, quietly taking notes. One older woman, named Doris, recounted how the HOA abruptly relocated her porch swing without permission, then billed her. Another man, Mr. Herrera, was forced to remove a small greenhouse used to grow vegetables for his grandchildren. The greenhouse didn't adhere to approved exterior structures, and the fines had rolled in until he dismantled it under pressure. By twilight, Grandma and I had built a small mountain of anecdotal evidence. It was disheartening to see how many people had quietly endured these tactics, too fearful or exhausted to fight back. Grandma's expression grew increasingly grim. Morgan, we're onto something. This is bigger than just a fence. If Perkins and the HOA are systematically extorting fees from vulnerable homeowners, it might constitute racketeering. Her words sounded ominous. Racketeering was a term I associated with mob bosses and shady underworld dealings, not pastel suburbia. But the parallels were glaring. Intimidation, forced compliance, inflated fees, threats of legal action. We'll need proof that Perkins personally profits from these fees, she said, walking to the pantry for a fresh tea bag. If it all goes into legitimate HOA improvements, that's one thing. But if he's lining his pockets... She trailed off, gaze resting on the battered fence outside. A new determination sparked in her eyes. I'd like to pay the HOA office a little visit tomorrow. But first, let me make one more phone call. I waited, nibbling on a stale cookie while Grandma stepped out onto the porch to take the call in private. The sun dipped below the horizon, leaving streaks of gold and crimson across the sky. It should have been a peaceful evening, the kind where we'd watch old movies and share recollections of simpler times. Instead, we had a fence in ruins, a yard lined with spikes, and an envelope detailing how we somehow owed over $1,000 for the privilege. When Grandma returned, she wore a cryptic smile. I spoke with an old friend in the state attorney's office. She's willing to keep an eye on things from the sidelines. She also said something quite interesting. Maplewood Terrace has been flagged more than once for questionable practices. So the state's aware? She nodded. They are, but they haven't had conclusive evidence to do anything. Yet. That's where we come in. She placed a comforting hand on my shoulder. It's going to be a bumpy ride, Morgan. We'll be rummaging through paperwork, talking to frightened neighbors, maybe even making a few enemies along the way. but I need your help. Are you with me? I looked at her, my grandmother who had guided me through every storm. My chest tightened with equal parts worry and pride. Always. She smiled softly, pulling me into a brief hug. Then let's get to work. Tomorrow, we find Mr. Perkins. The following day, we arrived at the Maplewood Terrace HOA office just after noon. The building was deceptively unremarkable. A small, single-story structure with tinted windows and a generic sign that read Community Resource Center. The parking lot was half empty, save for a couple of sedans and one shiny SUV that boasted a personalized plate. SRP, presumably Sylvester R. Perkins. Grandma parked her trusty old station wagon, marched up to the front doors, and pushed them open. Inside, the receptionist's desk was unoccupied. A ring bell for service sign perched on the counter. Grandma gave the bell a sharp press. Moments later, a startled young woman in a floral blouse scurried from a back room. "May I help you?" she asked in a sing-song voice. Grandma's expression was all business. "I'd like to speak with your president, Mr. Perkins." The receptionist blinked. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Grandma replied. "But I'd suggest you let him know Harriet Storm is here to discuss the matter of spiked fences and questionable fees." The young woman's face went pale. Please wait here." She scurried back through a door labeled staff only, leaving us standing in the small lobby. I leaned into Grandma. "Is that how you usually handle these things?" A sliver of a grin appeared. "Sometimes showing confidence is half the battle. Trust me, dear." We didn't wait long. The door swung open again, and out came Sylvester R. Perkins himself, the same man who had hammered spikes into the ground in front of Grandma's cottage. Only this time, he wasn't wearing a neon vest. Clad in a crisp shirt and expensive tie, he exuded the same smug self-assurance as before. "Miss Storm, is it?" He feigned polite curiosity, but couldn't conceal the recognition in his eyes. "And Morgan, correct? I do hope you've come to settle your outstanding invoice." Grandma gave him a level stare. "No, Mr. Perkins. We've come to discuss the legality of these so-called corrective measures and the extortionate bills you're sending to residents." His jaw tightened. "That's strong language. I'd be careful about accusations like that." Unfazed, Grandma continued. "I'm curious where the money from these force modifications is being allocated. Specifically, the funds for my fence demolition invoice." Perkins gestured for us to follow him into a cramped conference room decorated with motivational posters about neighborhood harmony and cooperative spirit. He took a seat at the head of the table, motioning for us to sit as well. "Mrs. Storm, Maplewood Terrace is a covenant community. Our guidelines are legally binding for all homeowners. When they fail to comply, we step in to maintain standards. It's as simple as that." Grandma's gaze bore into him. "It's not simple when you target older or vulnerable residents and demand inflated fees. I've spoken to several neighbors. We have enough to suggest a pattern of harassment." For a flicker of a second, Perkins looked uncertain. Then he leaned back, steepling his fingers. "You sound like you're building a case," he said in a measured tone. "But you need more than anecdotes and speculation. And you need to prove malice or personal gain." Grandma reached in her purse and retrieved a slim folder. "We have itemized receipts for certain forced changes, like the rose garden turned into a gravel patch, and the labor costs are triple the local average. That's suspicious, wouldn't you agree?" He shrugged, his mouth curving in an oily smile. "We contract with specialized teams who provide premium services. Quality costs. If you have an issue, you can bring it up at the next board meeting, but it won't change the official process." My temper flared, and I blurted, "You can't justify uprooting people's property and forcing them to pay for what's basically vandalism." Perkins shot me a pointed look. "Young man," I cut him off. "I'm a woman, actually," I snapped, though I tried to keep my tone level. I often kept my hair short and my features could be taken for masculine, but this was the first time it bothered me so intensely. Maybe it was the dismissive sneer in his voice. He blinked and cleared his throat. "My apologies." With a slight wave of his hand, he turned back to Grandma. "Regardless, I run a legitimate operation here. If you truly have proof of wrongdoing, you can file a complaint. But until then, I suggest you pay your debts and follow the rules like everyone else." Grandma rose. We'll certainly be pursuing the matter. And I'd advise you to keep any further spikes or sledgehammers off my lawn unless you want to discuss it with the police next time. Perkins's gaze flicked to the small pin on Grandma's lapel, the quiet symbol of her position in the legal system. He didn't appear fully intimidated, but there was a glimmer of caution in his eyes. "Do what you must, Miss Storm," he said coolly. In silence, we left the conference room. As we neared the exit, the receptionist waved timidly, looking relieved to see us go. Once outside, Grandma exhaled deeply. "He's confident. This might be tougher than I thought. Because he's covering himself with the official rules?" I guessed. Grandma nodded. "He's counting on scare tactics, complicated legal jargon, and HOA guidelines that are intentionally vague. It's insidious." Climbing back into the station wagon, we pulled out of the parking lot and onto the oak-lined street. Grandma's hands gripped the steering wheel firmly. "Perkins must have a money trail," she muttered. "I want to see every financial document that passes through that HOA office. If we can show that the fees are lining his pockets instead of going toward legitimate community improvements, we'll have enough to press charges." I hesitated. "Is that something you can just access?" She gave a humorless laugh. "Not without probable cause or subpoena power. But I can talk to the county records office about the HOA's financial statements. They're often required to file some public disclosures, depending on how they're structured." My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from an unknown number. "Be careful, Harriet Storm and friend. The HOA doesn't take kindly to troublemakers." I showed Grandma the message. A tense smile tugged at her lips. "They're intimidated. That's good news. It means we're shaking their fortress." She put her phone in the cup holder. "But keep an eye out, Morgan. Power-hungry people can get desperate when cornered." That evening, we scheduled a meeting with a handful of neighbors who were willing to speak out. We gathered in our living room, sipping tea as folks recounted their ordeals. Doris clutched her purse, her voice trembling with both fear and relief as she described how she nearly had her home liened for a hidden fine. Mr. Herrera gave us copies of his letters from the HOA, threatening legal repercussions if he didn't tear down his greenhouse within 10 days. Another couple, the Johnsons, were forced to replace their siding at an inflated cost because it wasn't the right hue of beige. Grandma recorded each statement meticulously. "We need to remain calm and organized," she said gently. "We have to show patterns of abusive practice, not just one-off incidents." Doris glanced around, eyes watery. "No one's ever tried to help us before. We were scared." "Thank you, Harriet." Grandma nodded. "I'm doing what's right. We all deserve to feel safe in our homes." Her expression hardened. "And if the HOA thinks they can use fear to control us, they're about to learn a harsh lesson in the law." A murmur of agreement spread through the group. I caught the glimmer of something in their eyes. Hope. It reminded me of a phrase Grandma loved. "Evil flourishes when good people do nothing." It appeared that for the first time, good people in Maplewood Terrace were ready to act, that we spent the next week in a whirlwind of detective work. Grandma pored over public records at the county clerk's office, emailing me scanned documents to cross-reference. Meanwhile, I hopped from house to house, verifying addresses and collecting statements, photos, and copies of notices. It felt like we were building a puzzle from shattered fragments. Each conversation revealed another piece of the HOA's shady practices, another victim of sky-high fees or forced changes. And the deeper we dug, the clearer the pattern. For nearly every violation, the contractors who came to fix the problem were the same 3 or 4 companies, none of which were local. After an entire day of searching, Grandma discovered these companies were shell businesses, all tied back to a single P.O. box in another city. The man behind that P.O. box was listed as S. Perkins. The revelation left me breathless. He's awarding the work to his own shell companies, then funneling the HOA fees to himself. That's classic fraud. Grandma nodded gravely. Exactly. All we need is enough direct evidence to present to the authorities. With these documents linking Perkins to the shell companies, we have a strong case for criminal charges. It felt like triumph was near, but we needed a final push, something indisputable that would bring the hammer down. We had to prove beyond any doubt that Perkins was exploiting the HOA for personal profit, not just making questionable decisions. One brisk morning, as I was compiling our evidence in the living room, Grandma's phone buzzed. She answered, and a familiar tension rippled across her brow. "Who's this?" she asked carefully. Her gaze flicked to me, then to the window. "What do you want?" I tiptoed closer, trying to catch the voice on the other end. Grandma's jaw clenched, her face going pale. "Don't you dare threaten my granddaughter," she said icily. "And don't think I won't trace this call. You're playing with fire." She hung up, her hand trembling. "Who was that?" I whispered. She exhaled, setting the phone down. A disguised voice. "They said they know we're prying into HOA business and suggested we drop it before someone gets hurt." Anger flared in my chest, then a spike of fear. "You think it's Perkins?" Grandma pursed her lips. "Could be one of his cronies. Either way, we can't afford to back down. We're too close." She shot me a hard look that softened after a moment. "But I want you to stay vigilant, Morgan. Don't walk alone at night. Keep your phone charged, all that." My stomach twisted. I'd lived a fairly quiet life. The idea that some petty tyrant in an HOA could escalate to personal threats felt surreal. But Grandma was unfazed. Her years in the legal system had steeled her nerves. That afternoon, we held one final neighborhood meeting to finalize our statements. Nearly a dozen residents crammed into our living room. The mood was resolute. Doris sat with a supportive hand on Mr. Herrera's shoulder, while the Johnsons quietly sorted through receipts. Everyone was tired of living in fear. Everyone wanted Perkins brought to justice. Grandma stood at the front of the room, voice steady. "We've gathered substantial proof that the HOA president, Sylvester R. Perkins, has engaged in fraudulent practices. I have enough to bring this to the district attorney's office. I intend to do so first thing tomorrow." A wave of relief and nervousness swept through the room. Some people feared retaliation. Others worried about the time and energy that legal proceedings would require. But the universal sentiment was a willingness to see this through. The next morning, dawn broke clear and bright. Grandma and I loaded our station wagon with boxes of labeled documents and digital backups on flash drives. The plan was to drive downtown to the district attorney's main office. Once the evidence was in official hands, Perkins's intimidation tactics would be outmatched by the weight of the state's legal system. We were halfway to the freeway on-ramp when a black sedan pulled alongside us, revving its engine. Grandma stiffened. I glanced out the passenger window. The driver's face was masked by tinted glass, but the car swerved threateningly close. My heart hammered. Grandma accelerated to put distance between us, but the sedan sped up too, riding our bumper. Then, in a squeal of tires, it zoomed ahead and cut us off, forcing Grandma to slam the brakes. Documents slid across the back seat, and my seat belt bit into my collarbone. My mind reeled. Was this some orchestrated scare tactic? Grandma gritted her teeth, her expression like flint. "Brace yourself," she said, and swerved around the sedan, ignoring the blaring horn behind us. Within seconds, we were back on track, merging onto the freeway. The black car lingered a moment, then roared away in the opposite direction. "That was no coincidence," I said shakily. Grandma's hands were white-knuckled on the wheel. "They won't stop us." Her voice trembled with anger. "I swear, Morgan, these people are going down." At last, we arrived at the district attorney's office, hearts still pounding. We hauled the boxes inside and asked to see the DA or an authorized representative. A clerk directed us to a serious-looking attorney in a glass-paneled office. Grandma introduced herself formally, presenting her badge and explaining the situation. The attorney's eyes widened as we unpacked the trove of documents, contracts, receipts, testimonies. "This is extensive," the attorney murmured, flipping through pages. "And you say these shell companies are all linked to Perkins?" Grandma nodded, her resolve shining through her exhaustion. "Yes, and we have enough witnesses to fill a courtroom." The attorney adjusted her glasses. "This is more than enough for a full investigation. The state attorney's office will coordinate with local authorities to freeze any questionable transactions. We can also file for an injunction to stop immediate HOA enforcements." Relief flooded me. Grandma and I exchanged a triumphant glance. We'd done it. No matter what Perkins tried next, the state now had eyes on him. True to form, the legal gears moved quickly under Grandma's watchful guidance. Within days, law enforcement served Perkins with a subpoena. Rumor had it he tried to bluster his way out, but the documentation was too damning. As word spread through Maplewood Terrace, neighbors who once cowered behind locked doors started stepping forward, adding their accounts to the growing file. In the end, the HOA board itself imploded, as other members distanced themselves from Perkins to avoid criminal charges. Meanwhile, the forced modifications halted. No more spikes, no more sledgehammers in the night. A new, interim HOA board was hastily formed, pledging transparency and fairness. The day after Perkins's arrest, I walked outside to see a city worker removing the last of the metal spikes from Grandma's lawn. The battered fence, too, was being restored, courtesy of a community volunteer group that rallied around Grandma once they understood what she'd done for them. Standing next to me, Grandma folded her arms. "We got justice," she said softly. I nodded, a swirl of pride and gratitude welling inside me. "You sure did, Grandma. And I don't think Perkins will be out of jail anytime soon." She chuckled, patting my arm. "Now about those rose bushes. I say we plant twice as many." I laughed, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. Together, we stepped off the porch, the scent of fresh-cut grass and newly turned soil filling the air. Neighbors waved from across the street, their smiles genuine, some mouthing thanks. A sense of renewed community blossomed in that moment, a sign that Maplewood Terrace, bruised as it was, would recover. As for Grandma, Harriet Storm, she never once boasted about her role as the unstoppable assistant state prosecutor. She didn't need to. Her deeds spoke loud enough. And in the quiet hush of early evening, when I glanced at the rising moon over her newly freed front yard, I could almost hear her wise old voice again. "Don't let anyone tell you you're powerless in your own home." She had shown Maplewood Terrace, and me, that truth. And from that day onward, nobody, not even the most iron-fisted HOA, would dare to strip away Grandma's right to live in peace. The end.